Melinda. Test 1, 2, Melinda.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bienvenue. This is the Finance and Economic Development Committee, Tuesday, February 5th, and I believe we have quorum. Those members of the audience who would like to address committee, if you could fill out a form by the door under the Ottawa sign and give it to one of our staff, we'd be happy to hear from you. Declarations of interest? None. Confirmation of minutes, 28, le 21 janvier 2013. Minutes from the 21st of January 2013. Carried. Item number 1, midterm governance review. We have 2 delegations. We'll come back to that. Item number 2, attendance at OGRA, Roma, FCM, AMO, and AFMO. Participation conférence as presented. Carried. Item number 3, appointments to the Wellington West Business Improvement Areas. Nomination au Conseil de gestion de la zone d'amélioration commerciale de Wellington West. That we appoint Liliane Piazza and Robert Cabana to the BIA. Carried. Status update, Finance and Economic Development Committee. Motions, rapport de situation, demande de renseignement et motion du comité. Received. Item number 5, rapport général sur les services juridiques pour la période de 1er octobre au 31 décembre 2012, Comprehensive Legal Services Report. Received. Item number 6, from the City Treasurer and Finance, Municipal Capital Facility Agreement, new OC Transpo Lost and Found location, 400-412 MacArthur Avenue. Entente relative aux immobilisations municipales. This is the Lost and Found. It is run by a charity, and their building in Lower Town, I guess, has been sold. Yeah, they're moving to MacArthur. So on this recommendation from staff, carried. We thank them for the good work they do. Planning and Infrastructure, Real Estate Partnership and Development Office, Delegation of Authority, Acquisition, Disposal, and Lease of Real Property from le 1er juillet à 31 décembre 2012. Received. Sale of land, vente de terrain, 187 Rue Bottler, 187 Bottler Street in Rito Vanier Ward. Staff are recommending the sale of this property. Carried. Okay, so we have midterm governance review. Maybe Madam Deputy Clerk or Mr. Clerk, you can just give us a very brief overview on the tradition and history of midterm governance, and then we'll go to our 2 members of the public who wish to speak. Both have indicated they agree with the report, so I don't know, Rick, if you're going to start.
Mr. Mayor, and I'm at the yours and the committee's indulgence. We do have a PowerPoint if they wanted to hear it all. I know it's a lengthy 72-page report, and most of the members, well, all members of council were consulted as we went through this. So I can give a brief overview if you'd rather. There's a feedback, Mr. Mayor.
Little voices. Would members of committee like the overview? Okay, so if you'd like to do the PowerPoint, and then we'll get to Sherry Franklin, followed by Tom Moss and Larry. I'm going to mispronounce Larry's last name, Maschke.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire et les membres de la comité. Since amalgamation, the City of Ottawa has undertaken governance reviews twice over each term of council, first every 18 months and subsequently every 24 months. And as members will recall, the first governance review takes place at the beginning of the term of council, and traditionally this is when major changes are made with regards to the governance structure of the city and its various tools with regards to governing. And this would include, Mr. Mayor, the last time around in December of 2010, the establishment of a independent or arm's-length transit commission, and also a very detailed accountability framework. Conversely, the midterm governance review traditionally tweaks the governance structure to address any issues that have arisen during the first 24 months, and any major matters that are identified in that are usually put off until final governance once again. Pour les questions de courant, there are recommendations. Essentially, we have them down to three, Monsieur le Maire. Délégué de modification de la structure de gouvernance, la composition des comités, les présidentes et vice-présidentes, les conseils locaux, politique et processus de gouvernance, les réponses aux directives du Conseil, questions soumises par le vérificateur général et certaines nouvelles initiatives. Mr. Mayor, with regards to today's presentation, as I indicated earlier, the report is some 72 pages long and includes 30 recommendations. We won't be going through all of those. I'm going to try to highlight in the three areas noted on the slide what we'll be looking at, and that will be the focus for today's presentation. So beginning, Mr. Mayor, with regards to routine matters, I just want to make a short comment with regards to committee and commission membership processes. It's very clear to members of council, but maybe less transparent to members of the public of what we do during midterm governance. So as part of the meetings that we had with individual members of council, Mr. Mayor, each is asked how they're satisfied with their workloads and with the committees and local boards that they're on, and it provides them with an opportunity to effectively trade those off. So by way of example, Mr. Mayor, when we met with Councillor Blais last fall, he indicated a desire to leave the IT subcommittee, and conversely, Councillor Kadri, who I saw earlier this morning, indicated a desire to sit on the IT subcommittee, so it was a very easy switch in that regard. However, some changes do have multiple implications. Councillor Blais was, in fact, the vice chair of the IT subcommittee, so we had to take that into consideration, and all of those things are set out in various grids of documents 1 and 2 of the report. Other changes, Mr. Mayor, are mostly housekeeping. As the Chair of Transit Commission sits with you this morning, we understand that there were matters with regards to the petition policy that should have gone to the Transit Commission. Staff didn't catch that when we established the Transit Commission. And similarly with all audits related to operational matters for the Transit Commission, so those recommendations are made here before you to ensure that those are routed to the proper area. In addition, Mr. Mayor, I spoke at length with the Auditor General with regards to his reporting protocols, it being midterm. He made a number of suggestions, which I agree with and staff agreed with, and primarily being not referring each and every audit in the annual report to the relevant standing committees for the purpose of hearing public delegations. Mr. Mayor, we went back and checked, and over the last, I think, 4 or 5 years, and the Auditor General may be here, I don't remember how many dozens of audits that was, we only received 4 public delegations. So the recommendation is to reroute them just to this committee and then back on to Council. Mr. Mayor, with regards to the delegation of authority bylaw, which Council I know is very familiar with, the vast majority of changes in there are with regards to reorganizations, staff reporting to different people that have occurred over the last few years, and also a desire to provide greater clarity within the existing delegations, or where we could, Mr. Mayor, streamline and expedite matters. One of the examples that we do have 3, we think, larger changes deals with what I describe as the nearly urban lands in the rural areas. Normally, these would be matters that would automatically fall to the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee and within their jurisdiction. However, there's been a sort of a practice developed over the last little while where, with the concurrence of the 2 committee chairs and indeed with the ward councillor or councillors, and I'll come back to the plurality there, Mr. Mayor, these reports would then go to Planning Committee. Obviously, where there is no concurrence, it would remain a matter for ARAC to deal with. The second issue that is a clear change to past practice was where there were planning applications which included more than 1 ward, so there were straddled ward boundaries, 2 and sometimes 3 ward boundaries. And staff were asked to go away and provide a resolution to that and formalize, I think, largely, again, past practice. So we've gone away and councillors have agreed and consensus was reached that where the ward councillors agree on going forward, that it can go to Planning Committee, and we believe this will be a consistent approach. So again, Mr. Mayor, consensus between the ward councillors is going to be key to driving these slightly amended initiatives. Finally, Mr. Mayor, with regards to the delegating authority to staff to provide cultural capital facilities fund grants, and these are very clearly within existing council-approved policies, criterias, and budgets. And this was an issue that was raised recently over the last little while, the last year or so. We've gone back and looked at this and try to provide some consistency with other grant programs, so that'll be delegated to staff in the immediate future. Mr. Le Maire, I'm going to turn it over to the Deputy now to take the next few slides.
So among the directions to council, from council that this report addresses was the referral from council with respect to the Arts Heritage, and I'm probably naming it wrong, Arts Heritage and Culture Action Plan. In that report, staff recommended that the governance of the commemorative naming policy change to be a committee external to the city. We were already reviewing the commemorative naming policy, and council referred that recommendation to this report. So first, in consultations with members of council and the fact that this is considered in the province a municipal best practice, we're not recommending any changes to the governance of the policy. That being said, there are some conventions that have occurred over the development in the past 10 years of the implementation of the policy that we are going to incorporate, we are recommending incorporating into the policy, as well as just some streamlining. The first one is reducing the consultation period to 30 days for most nominations. Most of the feedback comes in within the first week of us soliciting public input and then on the day of the deadline. So shortening that will facilitate the process. The other thing is where there are no objections from the community is eliminating the need for a second commemorative naming committee and just allow the report to proceed directly to standing committee and council for approval. And the other issue is currently where members of council want to name, for example, a bridge or a walking trail. The policy only covers parks, facilities, and street names. We're going to allow members of council to funnel names for any city infrastructure through the commemorative naming process rather than having to bring a motion to council. That'll allow for more consultation. The other issue is restricting the commemorative naming to only names of individuals. We're going to expand that so members of council can also use the policy and the process for names such as Diamond Jubilee Park. It commemorates a historical event. The notion of Corktown Bridge, it could have gone through this policy brought forward. It makes more sense than bringing all of these things through motions to council. In this, one of the challenges that staff have experienced with the commemorative naming policy is the desire of residents to use the commemorative naming process for in memoriam namings. So naming people who have just died, and most often from our perspective it is through traffic accidents, and there's a desire to name traffic infrastructure in memoriam. It's not the intention of the policy. Although the city currently has a commemorative tree and a commemorative bench program, which is where we refer in memoriam namings for traffic, this is not satisfactory. So as part of our consultations with members of council, one of them had said that he had seen roadside safety signage in memoriams working in other jurisdictions. We met with city staff and public works. They agreed that they had heard of this program and felt that it would be an effective option, both for traffic management, safety signage, fairly low cost for in memoriam, and more appropriate than, say, a tree or a park for members whose families have died. So this could be, watch cyclists in memory of. The cost we've discussed with staff. We won't have, if council approves, we'll do final costing, but the expectation is that where the memorial tree program will cost a resident $400, the memorial bench program will cost $2,000. This one should cost no more than a couple $100, and staff can erect the signs within existing budgets. So we are recommending this. It will help residents for whom there is a need that our policies don't currently cover. So the next set of routine matters is a recommended change to the election-related resources policy, which is essentially modifying the blackout period to coincide with the city's regulations with respect to election signs on private property. So the notion will be when the election signs go up on private property, the blackout period of involving the city will be in effect. The other cleanups to the policy are essentially making clear some things that have been less than clear, which is that the policy, which we do in practice, apply to federal and provincial elections, partisan participation, it will explicitly say so in the policy.
Mr. Mayor, with regards to other bodies, during this midterm governance review, we also addressed issues for specific local boards. And it's important because that's a legal terminology used with respect to a number of local boards here at the city, but in particular for these purposes, the Cumberland Heritage Village Museum, the Nepean Museum, the Ottawa Municipal Campground, and the Pineview Golf Course. And the latter two, Mr. Mayor, were referrals from the Auditor General's previous audits on those two bodies. Most members of Council will recall that the Municipal Act was amended in 2007 and effective January 1st, 2008 to ensure that councils across the province became statutorily responsible for the governance structure not only of the municipality but also of its local boards. And in addition, councils are responsible for the accountability, the transparency, and the financial management of not only, again, the municipality, but also the operations of its local boards. In addition to that, Mr. Mayor, Section 270 of the Municipal Act was amended to ensure that all local boards were mandated to have 4 particular policies, those being a procedure bylaw inherent with a notice provision section, and policies with respect to the sale and disposition of land, the hiring of staff, and the procurement of goods and services. Over the last few years, Mr. Mayor, we have been working with our local boards, including BIAs, reminding them of their statutory obligations and providing templates in all of those areas. Compliance, Mr. Mayor, quite frankly, is still a little bit far off from where we'd like it to be. And the next steps, I understand, we've made recommendations in the report that the BIAs will be working directly with our staff in economic development and each of the local boards on an individual basis to bring those policies more into compliance. We'll be back in the final governance review at this term and the beginning of the next term to complete a complete and comprehensive status report on the agencies, boards, and commissions, and deal with any non-compliant issues under the Municipal Act at that point in time. Again, Mr. Mayor, with respect to the other local boards, the report has recommendations related to the governance of the 2 community museums, which are still operating under a municipal local governance model, that being the Cumberland and the Nepean Museums. In short, Mr. Mayor, the report is recommending that the governance change retain the community involvement in the strategic direction of the museums through a departmental working group. Members of Council are familiar with those with regards to taxi and First Nations here that we use at Ottawa. It's also been a group that's worked well with the Billings Estate Museum, and all financial accountability and staff management will ultimately, if the recommendation is accepted, go with the City of Ottawa. That said, Mr. Mayor, it's important to point out that the Friends of Fairfields would retain its role in this entire process with respect to the Community Foundation and Ottawa's endowment. Mr. Mayor, with regards to the Nepean Museum, I can advise that staff, myself and from my office, and also from the General Manager Parks, Recreation and Culture, met with 3 members of the board of the Nepean Museum yesterday. We had a very full and frank discussion for almost an hour. And also, I can advise that they provided us with very good input with regards to a possible more comprehensive future review of all of the city's museums.
As the clerk mentioned, the matter of the governance for both the Ottawa Municipal Campground Authority and the Pineview Municipal Golf Course Board were referred to directly by those audits to this review. In the interim, the National Capital Commission's request for proposal process on the Nepean Equestrian Park was undertaken and has been completed. So the issue of governance is really, in effect, rendered a bit moot by that process, because we have been advised that the winning proponent does involve the campground lands, but we don't know all of the details of how that will roll out. So what we're doing is waiting on the NCC for them to inform us about when they need the land, and when we know that, staff will be bringing forward a proposal on how to wind down operations at the campground. In terms of Pineview, what we discovered, the clerk and I, when we did our one-on-one interviews is that there was no consensus about the role of Pineview Municipal Golf Course in the city's recreation plan and what should be done with it. As a consequence, we did not feel that it would be wise to make a recommendation with respect to governance until council had time to consider what in fact they wish to do with Pineview and how that service fits in with the core mandate of the city. So the recommendation is for staff to review the relationship with the city, come back with a comprehensive report. Once council's made that decision, we can make recommendations with respect to governance. The recommendation with respect to the additional temporary FTE for the deputy mayor scheduling has garnered the most questions as part of this report. So I wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about this position and why we are requesting it. First is the notion of whether events are an optional service. And we always, in our office, refer to the Municipal Act and legislation on first principles. And we will note Section 226.1 listed there is that the head of state council shall act as the representative of the municipality and shall participate in and foster activities that enhance the economic, social, environmental well-being of the municipality and its residents. There's also Section 225D, which says that the head of council shall act on behalf of the city for protocol events. In our world, shall is not optional in legislation. Shall means must. And in our view, this is a core function of the municipality, which is why the city clerk's office provides assistance to the mayor by having a role of scheduler. The other thing that we would observe is that the 4,800 invitations that we receive a year indicates to us that many, many other parts of the municipality also view this as a core function. These 4,800 invitations, we don't go out and solicit them, and they do not incorporate city-sponsored events, which are also there. These are events that range in diversity from the organizers of the CNIB Open House for Vision Health Month, the Ottawa Armenian Festival, the Chills for CHIO event, the North American Occupational Health and Safety Flag Raising, Uville Center graduations. They are small business openings. They are anything and everything that you can imagine. And in many of these cases, they are run by community volunteers. And although I've heard critics say that perhaps these are unimportant, we can tell you that these are extremely important to the individuals organizing them. And of the 4,800 invitations where a mayor or deputy mayor cannot attend, a no does not mean that there's no work. Many of these organizations will then request formal greetings, written greetings, certificates, notes of congratulations to graduates. There is work attached to each of these events, and every one of them is responded to personally. In terms of the actual FTE, the notion is that this would be similar to the level of support that is currently provided to the chairs of the standing committees, such that the deputy mayor's constituency work is not impacted by citywide obligations. It can be accommodated within existing budgets. The reduction in the mayor's office budget and the reductions in conference spending mean that there is room to fund this. But I do want to talk about the $75K amount. In staff's desire to be transparent and accurate, we've put in that amount which will more than cover all ancillary costs. The $75K is not the salary. The salary is $52,000. The rest is benefits and some ancillary costs that will be, associated with putting in a computer and potentially some overtime. We, as you know, members of council and clerk's office are like to come in under budget, and I just want to be very clear that the $75,000 is not a salary.
Monsieur le maire, pour les nouvelles initiatives, 3 more slides or so, Mr. Mayor, recommandait la création d'une politique de divulgation courante et proactive divulgation annuelle des budgets et des cadeaux pour les événements du bureau de protocole, et divulgation proactive des contrats importants, documents excités. Mr. Mayor, with regards to the last one, just very briefly, members of council remember the direction that was given to myself and city staff with regards to the public disclosure and putting online of all contracts. We were ordered to go away and discuss it, and we did with the Chief Procurement Officer and the various members of the ATIP office to make sure we were doing everything within the legislative requirements of MFIPA, and we set out the recommendations in the report. With regards to the second one, just reporting out on the gifts and events done by my office and protocol. Mr. Mayor, just a brief point on the first one, the recommendation for a proactive disclosure and a routine disclosure. Just very simply said, we're looking forward to proactively disclosing documents after we meet with each department to ensure that they routinely publish documents so they're not asked for those. And second off, the routine disclosure digs down a little deeper, where we will establish with operating departments lists of documents that they will able, when someone phones in or writes in, they'll just look up the list and say, yep, just automatically release it, thereby deviating and going away from the formal MFIPA process and the timelines therein. With regards to council remuneration, Mr. Mayor, the slide sets out the background in the spirit of full disclosure. I think it's important because if anybody goes back and reads the Citizens Task Force on Council Remuneration, you'll find out that as Deputy Clerk of the day, I was the lead staff member who was liaison with that particular group. That being said, Mr. Mayor, the three recommendations that are dealt with in this report, I think, are in keeping with the standard practice of regularly reviewing all of our city's policies and procedures. And I'm just going to be very brief, Mr. Mayor, with regards to these. Next slide, please. With regards to these recommendations that are being addressed, number one, to establish a consistent go-forward approach. With regards to cost of living increases to members of council, we put in a lot of detail in the report with regards to what the actual transition body said in 2000, then what the Citizens Task Force said, neither of which was ever completely followed for a variety of different reasons. Council set out different establishments over the last few years, and we're recommending that a standard annual cost of living increase by council be, quite frankly, established at the same rate as our MPE group, that's our Management and Professional Exempt group. We also have some details with regards to trying to level the playing field for members of council who are over the age of 65 and ensuring that they receive the same benefits as other members of council. And finally, Mr. Mayor, with regards to the transition allowance, we're recommending that this include members who retire. I know that the task force wanted it to be more or less like individuals who've been fired from their jobs, so therefore you would have to run for elected office. Staff actually disagree with that approach. Members of council will appreciate you don't get employment insurance after you leave. And quite frankly, if you read the task force report, it actually points out that there are surveys to indicate that members who leave elected office at the provincial and federal level actually find it very difficult finding other jobs. So I believe that it's appropriate to engage at this point in time. Mr. Mayor, that's the staff overview, and we'd be pleased to take any questions after the members of the public come forward.
Okay, thank you. So we'll save staff questions because we have two delegations. So first is Sherry Franklin. Welcome, Ms. Franklin. If you can come up beside Rick O'Connor, and we thank you for taking time to visit us. And each member of the public has 5 minutes, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Sherry Franklin, and I was married to Ben Franklin, the mayor of Nepean, for many years. Ben and others were part of the creation of the Nepean Museum, and this museum was proudly accepted into the community as a whole. I was on the Nepean Museum Board for a few years, and I had the position of vice president. Before the AGM last year, I resigned as I didn't agree with what was happening at the executive level. Last week, I was asked to look at the Ottawa website as the Nepean Museum was potentially going to be changed in its procedure around governance. I was very pleased to see that this city is planning to include the Nepean Museum as one of their museums. This is good on so many levels, such as it will end the discrimination of the city museums having professional advertising of its museums versus what the other smaller museums could afford. It will also end the constant movement of curators from the Nepean Museum to positions that have stability. We have had wonderful curators and staff that each year not only wonder if the city is going to give a grant and how much, but how much the volunteer board members would decide to pay. The staff at the Nepean Museum are professional and well qualified to operate this museum, and also the treasure that is Fairfield's. It is my hope that this staff as a whole will be kept while these changes happen. Kelly Boucher has been assigned Fairfields, and the Friends of Fairfields have worked for many years to get someone the caliber of Kelly. They are thrilled with her program and plans for Fairfields. This position must, in my opinion, be maintained by Kelly. This plan for the Nepean Museum and Fairfields will be beneficial for the long-term future of the Nepean heritage. This will give me the confidence that I need in making plans for Ben Franklin's mementos, and in fact, Andy Hayden's, if he chooses so. I have been concerned about this for some time, and is one of the reasons I joined the Nepean board. These changes will ensure me that children in the future will be able to hear Ben's voice. The core museum staff have been through so many changes in curators and board directions. Please don't postpone these changes. They need to be made now so that the anxiety of staff can be quickly settled. My only request is that the city retain these professional, capable staff members to ensure their expertise and knowledge of Nepean is not lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Frank. Does anyone have a question for Ms. Franklin? No. Thank you for the presentation and for your support. And I should also mention Peter's just being Peter. So I believe, Zian, we have a letter of support from Mary Pitt, the former mayor of Nepean as well, who's supporting the recommendation, as is Ms. Franklin. So thank you. Our next speaker, Tom Moss and Larry Mashke. Or is it just Tom speaking? Oh, okay. Hi, Tom. Welcome. And the floor is yours.
Good morning. Late last week, the Board of Trustees sent out a letter to the Mayor, to the Nepean councillors, and to the council members of this committee, indicating specifically its objection based on the issues, quote, that were not discussed with board members, that no consultation had occurred with respect to the governance findings, and that the governance recommended proposal was done without communicating to the impacted stakeholders. Excuse me. And for these reasons, the Board of Trustees requested that this committee defer a decision until meaningful communications occurred. Yesterday morning, 3 members of the Board of Trustees of the Nepean Museum, Tom O'Neill, our treasurer, Larry Matsky, and myself, met with city staff and the clerk's office to discuss the issues in a frank, honest, and meaningful manner. Our discussions also focused on the long-term future of the Nepean Museum and Fairfields Estates and the changing realities facing area museums in Ottawa. Afterwards, in a sidebar meeting with staff from Museum and Heritage, we came to better understand and appreciate the concept and implications regarding a departmental consultative group, specifically organized for and focused only on the Nepean Museum from a strategic and governance framework, and that this departmental consultative group would work in a strong collaborative relationship with a shared museum resource unit, with this unit having staff dedicated for the Nepean Museum, structured to deliver programs and services specifically aimed for the Nepean Museum and its catchment. In essence, what was being recommended was boards govern and oversee, staff are responsible for operations, and are accountable for performance. An organizational structure that has been well tested, tried, and true. The Nepean Museum Board of Trustees could not argue against this. Accordingly, the Board of Trustees, based on the above comments, are pleased to support the Reviews Committee's recommendation for the governance proposal for the Nepean Museum with the following 2 recommendations. 1, that a longer transition period be required to resolve the Incorporation Act CRA and HST issues and credits, Ontario Trillium Foundation contractual agreements, and labor issues resulting from the governance transformation. We would suggest that City staff and the Nepean Board of Trustees commence a working committee immediately after this motion is approved by Council to begin the transition exercise. We believe that a realistic date and timeline for transition would be June the 30th, 2013 as a target date. And the second recommendation, that current members of the Board of Trustees who are willing to become members of the new departmental consultative group focused on the Nepean Museum be appointed without having to undergo a recruitment process for their first term. Respectfully submitted. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moss. Are there any questions to the delegation? No. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, Councillor Shirelli, I know you have one motion, and if anyone else has a motion, if they could bring it forward, and then we'll go to questions for staff. Councillor Shirelli, would you like to introduce your motion, please?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Councillor Clark. It's moved by myself, whereas the midterm governance review recommends that City's Parks and Recreation and Cultural Services Department assume the management and operation of Nepean Museum and Fairfield's historic site. And whereas this change in governance will see the City make use of the Shared Museum Resources Unit to achieve efficiencies and the establishment of a departmental consultative group to retain the community input currently provided by its Board of Trustees. And whereas, as a result of discussions with some members of Nepean Museum's Board of Trustees, it is now recommended that the transfer of the operations of Nepean Museum and Fairfield's historic site to the City be accomplished with a longer transition period rather than the 60 days as currently recommended. Therefore, be it resolved that June 30th, 2013 be set as the final date of transfer of operations for the Nepean Museum and Fairfield historic site. And be it further resolved that any corresponding agreements and funding advancements be adjusted accordingly to support the transition period.
Thank you. So that's before us. Any other motions? So questions to staff? Absolutely. Councillor Hubley, Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Question for you on the two questions. I'll say Pineview. The staff recommendation is to leave Pineview as it stands, but I'm wondering why you came to that conclusion, because the board, of which I'm a member of, and the mayor and others, members of council, have spoken openly about the need to probably find a partner or get the city out of Pineview in order to make the investments to make it profitable.
First off, Mr. Mayor, the deputy was just reminding me again, the midterm governance report is based on a consensus basis from members of council in our consultation. I think there was no consensus that we could see reached on Pineview. Having said that, and I think Mr. Chenier is here if he wants to talk about the details of the operations. Staff, although this was originally viewed as a governance report, so very high up here with regards to processes and procedures and who would sit on the governing board, we rapidly came to the conclusion that the greater interest, I think, in a lot of members of council was whether or not this was a key function or role for Parks and Rec to play, and we didn't have that information at this point in time, hence the recommendation that we've put forward.
Okay. Would Mr. Chenier want to come and speak to that?
I think the city manager would like to offer a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will be working with Mr. Kanalakis and Mr. Chenier. I've already had an initial discussion with Mr. Trepanier at the NCC. As you know, the city has a long-term lease interest in that property from the NCC. So we'll be looking at how does that program run, what are alternatives for changing how it runs that would potentially more closely align with the city's core recreational program mandate, as the clerk's report indicates. That'll be the process, and we'll be undertaking this should council adopt this report.
Is there a timeline that you're going to come back to committee and council with a recommendation on Pineview?
It would be sometime this year. If there are changes that we would develop that we would deem worthy of recommendation to council for its consideration, it would be we'd focus on changes that would be able to be implemented in advance of the next golfing season.
So we would have enough time over the thank you. On the severance piece, the transition allowance, item number 3 of that says the recommendations above shall not apply to outgoing members of council who resign or are returning directly to organizations or established businesses where they were employed prior to serving on council. I'm a little curious about that. Does that mean that if you leave council and go to a job that you didn't have before, you still get the severance? And what happens in the case of a councillor that decides to become a consultant after the fact? How long does this apply?
Mr. Mayor, with regards to the first question, no, the member who was leaving politics and went off to a new job wouldn't be affected. Their transition allowance would not be effective. Again, part of that, the rationale underlying that recommendation is the fact that statutorily speaking, members of council are required to work right up until November 30th of the end of the term. With respect, you don't get to go and job hunt and do other things during the last 60 or 90 days, which may be more traditional in other areas of employment. With regards to the issue of whether or not sorry, we're just sharing. We are obviously dealing with some matters and dealing with the Integrity Commissioner on the pending Code of Conduct. We don't have what is known as a revolving door or restriction with regards to those types of matters at this point in time if members want to go off and be consultants.
Okay, because I'm just wondering, the way this is worded, and I realize this is not a new recommendation, this is something that was there prior. It's just the language of it leaves me with the impression that this policy would only apply to a very few people. Those that, with all due respect to my colleague, come here from high school, and those that are out and out retiring and not going on to anything. That would be and I'm wondering if there's a commitment that they don't go on to something, or do they have to pay back that severance?
Mr. Mayor, I think the essence is with regards to, and it's largely with regards to double dipping in the public sector. So if a member was off for another provincial government MPP or an MP at the federal government level, they wouldn't get the transition allowance. Obviously, they wouldn't need it. And again, there's only one taxpayer, and it would be seen in that view. I don't look at it as being extremely limited in that regard. As we've indicated in the report, Toronto and a number of other municipalities, although theirs are 12 and I think 18 months, we're looking at 6 months, which is, I think, fairly conservative.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Hubley. Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I have a number of things. Well, I'll start with the $75,000, which is not a salary. Now, who does the scheduling at the moment for all of these appointments?
We have one individual right now doing the work, and in the summers assisted by a summer student.
Now, is that employee in the mayor's office or is it in the city manager's office?
Neither. It's actually in the clerk's office.
I knew. Anyway, I was just suggesting we transfer that person and the $75,000 to the mayor's office, since that's generating it all, but I'll leave it at that for now. I won't put a motion forward. The other one that came up, I have no problem supporting the motion from Councillor Shirelli. I think it's not necessarily abrupt, but the extra time to make the transition move better is a good idea. I did have one other one, if I can find it. This report's long and thick. Amendment to the purchasing bylaw. It says here that we want to put a clause in to prohibit vendors and suppliers of goods, services, and construction who have legal actions pending against the city. I thought we had that all along. Is that not? What's new?
Actually, Mr. Mayor, nothing's new. We did put it in, council put it in for a 2-year pilot project.
As I can remember some very rigorous complaints about that, and Doug Cameron, bless him, who pointed out that we had no reason to do business with people that were, technically speaking, opposed to us.
That's correct, Mr. Mayor, and we're asking that it be kept in now. And
You
no
want to
longer-
codify it?
Exactly.
Is that all
Mr.
this
Mayor.
is? And I was, the other one was the blackout, June 30th. Was this a consensus decision? That's these pages aren't numbered. Pardon?
60 days before the election.
60 days would be August. This now
August
says
27th.
the direction of staff was June 30th. What's wrong with June 30th particularly? I mean, I don't care one way or the other, but it seems to me that whatever you choose is arbitrary.
Well, Mr. Mayor, there was actually, again, this was driven by consensus, and there were a number of ideas, and a couple of different councillors at different times raised with us the possibility of aligning it with the private signs bylaw, which is a 60-day period prior to the election day. And we went back and spoke to, again, a number of other councillors, and they thought there was a synergy and a census with that and made more of a common census. The members indicated you can, in fact, pick any date, and there were a number of dates, but that idea, aligning it with an existing bylaw of council, had a great deal of appeal to members.
Okay, because I kind of agree with the thrust of it. I just don't understand how the date got selected.
Anything else?
Yeah, that's enough.
Thanks, Councillor.
Oh, wait a minute. There's one other thing just reoccurred. I noticed the recommendations that we started with, that revised committee, board, other members outlined document 1 has no names in the recommendations, but does have for names in recommendation 3 for the Transit Commission members. And I would have thought that we should have highlighted the actual changes in the recommendation in item number 1.
We could certainly do that in the future, Mr. Mayor. We thought it was
I just
important.
wondered why you're trying to keep it a secret. You didn't really want people to know what was going on here?
No, Mr. Mayor.
That's very
Quite frankly, we just
sad.
wanted to make sure that because we were losing one of our public members on the Transit Commission,
It
we
was
wanted to make
just
sure. people-
noticeably different.
Understood, Mr. Mayor.
But it is in document 1, though.
I know where it is.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Eglai?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a few questions. Just on the allowance, the termination allowance, just for a bit more clarification, when you talk about business, does that include profession?
No, Mr. Mayor. What we were actually looking at when we were crafting this and discussing with members of council was in fact the Mayor Ford scenario. If you have a private business that you're going back to immediately, it's a family business, everyone knows that you're a partner or that's where you're going, that would be the case. That was sort of the scenario we were thinking of when we did this. Not to any particular profession. If you're a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, you may not have the opportunity to go back to from whence you came at the end of the day.
Quick question on the MFIPA requests. You use the term in the report, business as usual requests, but it wasn't clear to me what a business as usual request might be.
One of the things, Mr. Mayor, I found intriguing as we go through this, and we review a lot of the Information and Privacy Commissioner reports from time to time and her decisions. There are municipalities out there, and repeat, not the City of Ottawa, but municipalities out there that actually won't release a contract to a member of the public that's been put through the budget in a procurement process. We're not at that stage, but what we're trying to do is sit down with our colleagues in the other departments, and where they get a routine request for, site plan agreements, I don't want them saying, oh, well, go file an ATIP request, go file your $5, 30 days notice, and all of that. We want to be able to, in advance, sit down, develop a very practical list for each shop, and we've actually started looking at this already, so that staff would be able to easily identify those documents that they would just send out immediately. There would be no, so business as usual in that regard.
And I know that the press will be keenly interested in this question, but will the list be shared with the public? In other words, will people know in advance that they don't have to go ahead and make an MFIPA request?
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor. We were thinking that each department would have their own schedule, so it would be publicly listed.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about the blackout period for the election? I want to give you a couple of scenarios and see where we go. So within the 60 days prior to the election, there is a zoning or planning issue in your ward, and there's a timeline on the application. So there's to do your job well, you need to have some public consultation, you need to have a public meeting to discuss matters with your community association or the residents. How will that work within that 60-day window?
What happens, and we provide full training to counselors and assistants going forward, is you will send the request to us with the proposed communications materials. We will review and vet to ensure that it's not a big flashy picture that says, Councillor Eglai is, please come. It would say zoning application, public meeting, timelines, and those get permitted. So it's actually a formal submission process. You send us your materials, we vet and review them, and they go forward.
And who pays for that? Because the issue seems to be the use of city resources. So would that then come out of your department, or would it, once vetted, would it still come out of our office budgets? How is that going to work?
Once vetted, it comes out of your budget, Councillor.
Okay. I know a lot of us put out newsletters, either hard copy or electronic. I know I do one weekly. All of a sudden, it's going to stop. Are we allowed to message out the rationale to residents that have come to rely upon that over the last 4 years as to why suddenly their councillors' information about what's happening at City Hall, what's happening in the ward isn't available anymore, or isn't readily available anymore?
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor, and again, as long as the rationale is explained to your residents before the 60-day period kicks in, that would be fine.
And the follow-up question of that is, I assume one of the things that we do routinely in the office is a PSA comes out, we make sure that PSA gets to the community associations. I'm assuming, since it's a city-related program or policy, that's a process that we can still continue to do?
This is public information, and that would be standard news. At the same point in time, we would want to see any messaging that you would put out to that before, in addition to the standard PSA.
No, I'm just talking about flipping it, saying, to circulate to your community association members or what have you. So that would be acceptable as well.
Yes.
What about if you are invited to an event within that 60-day period? It's not your event, you're not funding it, but you're invited to attend as the councillor for the area. It's, I don't know, an anniversary of a church, of a school, something along those lines. What are the rules around that?
Mr. Mayor, there are what members who've never gone through a re-election process will learn is you essentially run nearly everything by the clerk's office during that period if you are, in fact, a candidate for election. We respond right away and we'll help you go forward on this. That's the rule of thumb.
So in other words, each attendance would have to be, under this process, would have to be vetted by your office?
Typically, yes. But, Mr. Mayor, there are general guidelines, and I think most returning members of council, and we will provide one-on-one training. It is actually not nearly as complex or onerous as it sounds. There are some things that you will be doing as a city councillor. So, for example, if there is a recreation centre opening in your ward, and the building is built when it's built, but we will review your speaking notes. We will ensure that you know that you can't have your campaign team there. There's just some basic protocols that occur.
And what about the funding of events within the 60 days, but the request has been made outside of the 60 days? No funding, no nothing. And that's fair enough. We're just looking for clarification.
Nothing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Moffat. Anyone else have questions? Councillor Wilkinson, Shirelli. Councillor Moffat.
First, just on the election-related policy, having run 2 elections against an incumbent, I can assure you that policy is a good policy, because I've seen the way incumbents use their resources to combat opponents like myself. So my actual question is on the delegate authority for capital grants. My question is, when was this put in here? It's probably a question for Mr. Chenier.
And as Mr. Chenier comes forward, Mr. Mayor, from the clerk's perspective, this was something that evolved over the last probably 6 or 8 months at various meetings.
So let's pretend this was in effect before last week. How would it have impacted the vote at council on the $250,000 grant that came out of that program? It would not have been before council, correct?
That's correct. The current limit is $50,000, but because the recommended grant in this case was $250,000, it had to come forward to council. But in the revised scenario, it would be delegated to staff to approve within the envelope of that program.
So when I was told that they would not be before council ask for more money, it's because this policy allows them not to be before council ask for more money? I'm just saying that's the reality of the program, is that if somebody wants more money to get up to the 25% qualifying costs for the project, they will not have to come back before council to ask for that money again, correct?
The specific discussion with that group was that, in fact, they had committed not to come back to council, that this would be their final ask. The money itself, though, is already in the budget as part of the 2013 capital budget within an envelope, so there is no new money. This is simply an allocation to the groups that will receive the money.
But just yes or no, if GCTC wants $250,000 more, they don't have to come back to council?
In the theoretical sense, if they were to come back in another year looking for additional funding and this delegation was approved, then yes, it would be done as part of the staff process.
All right, thanks.
Councillor Wilkinson, please.
Just wanted to confirm something from the answer that was given to Councillor Igla. On events in that 60-day period, if I recall the last election, I do Expo 55 Plus, and I was given approval to continue that, but there is an expense from my office to pay for the cost of that. And I was told at the time, because it's an ongoing, regular event, it could still happen. And what you just said was contrary to that.
I'm sorry, I may have misunderstood Councillor Eglai's question. You are quite correct, and Canada 55 Plus has occurred the same date since.
So any regular event that you're doing normally, yes, you can continue to do. I think that's important.
But the notion of funding and donations, and because the issue, which is what I had understood, and I apologize if I misunderstood Councillor Eglai's question, was the notion of giving donations to a community barbecue, donations to a fair.
Giving money to a group, so to say.
Yes.
Okay.
There's
So an event, a regularly scheduled event. And this other thing is that the question he made was things like a meeting about a zoning issue. There may be expenses in that. You may have to pay for a room or something like that. That still can continue because it's regular city business.
Yes, absolutely. It will funnel through the councilor's budget.
Just to make it clear. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Shirelli, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. On the 60-day time period with respect to planning matters, I'm concerned with the, maybe you can soothe my fears on this, but with the notice that we would be putting out concerning planning matters during the 60 days, in a recent election, it was, although we didn't have proof, it was fairly clear to most people that certain developers were planning their applications so they landed during the 60-day period, and thereby making it more difficult for members of council to rally the community on certain issues. In the notice that goes out, will there be accommodation so that the public will know what the position proposed by the member of council is going to be before they get to that meeting? if the member of council wants to do that. Like, I know it's not you. I know you're not going to permit big, flashy advertising, but I think the public has a right to know this is a member of council, and they're saying this, this, and this. They can disagree or agree.
Mr. Mayor, it is always hard to address hypotheticals. What we do say is that we judge each case on its merits on a case-by-case basis. And again, members who have experienced the practice of this policy before know that we will negotiate wording, we will negotiate the kind of letterhead, we can negotiate where that comes. We don't expect any change in that regard.
Yeah, what I've seen in the past is there's the letter of the rule that we're applying, but then the political expectation is actually more strict than that. And, has there been any consideration given to whether council can defer or stop for 30 days or 60 days planning applications that appear to be designed to peak right during that period?
Not with regards to the realm of governance, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Anyone else? I don't have anyone else on the list. No. Okay, on the report. Councillor Shirelli's motion, apologize first. Carried. On the report as amended. Carried. Notice is a motion for consideration at subsequent meetings. Are there any? Inquiries? Other business? Adjournment. Carried. Next meeting, Tuesday, February 5th, mardi le 5 mars. Merci. Meeting adjourned. Thank you all.